Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about learning through failure and mistakes. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Well, if you've listened to this podcast over the last few years, it probably won't be shocking to you that we like to read about education research and how we learn.
We're such geeks.
We are geeks.
Geeks.
We're also fascinated with how we deal with failure, as evidenced by one of our very first podcasts being about, actually, I think our first one, Mindset, Carol Dweck's book. Mm-hmm. And shockingly enough, we actually learn the most about learning when we read about the research around how children learn.
I know. Nobody's writing research about law students, really.
No, they're not. Because as adults, we can actually learn a lot from what's being done in the classroom with kids about better learning and retention. So, Lee, recently you sent over an article that was circulated by your kid's preschool teacher.
Yeah, because that's where I learned the most about learning is in preschool.
And all of our tutors read that article and were like, wow, this is really fascinating. We should talk to our law students about this.
Exactly. And what was interesting about this that was different than a lot of the other research I read that's like, our kids should be playing more, is it was really focusing on how mistakes can lead to better learning outcomes, especially around topics like math. And I think when we've been doing a lot of our reading and research, I find that a lot of the math research kind of aligns a little bit more with the law education, just because the difficulty, there's an emotional, mental element to it. It can be a stigma around it.
Well, and
there's a lot of process-based.
All basically goes back to logic as well.
Right, that too. And so we have linked to this article in the show notes from NPR, but here is the gist of it. It's kind of interesting. I was rereading it this morning, preparing for this podcast, and I was like, oh, there's such good stuff in here. All right, so buckle up, guys. This is a super exciting one. So the article talks about how we retain information, especially after we've made mistakes. And so when I was reading this, I immediately wanted to send it to the team was because it starts with a similar scenario to this one in like a children's classroom, but I changed it to the law school classroom because it's totally on point. So you can picture yourself in your law school classroom. Let's say the professor has asked a question and you are sure that you know the answer. So you shoot your hand up in the air and you get called on and you confidently answer the question. And then the prof tells you you're wrong and then discusses the right answer.
That's exactly what happened to me in Civ Pro. It was my most humiliating day in law school.
Yeah.
I still remember that feeling of the professor just blankly looking at me and saying, I think we're going to take another answer on that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what? He's like, no, there's nothing to work with here. That is just completely and totally off base.
Yep.
But I ended up being a TA in that class.
Yeah, I mean, my most memorable mistake in a law school class was in criminal law, and I was cold called on, but I was fumbling my way through the answer, and then I kind of embarrassingly got told to please be quiet because I was just filling the air in the room, and I was mortified. I thought the teacher, who I really liked, hated me, and then when he nominated me for some committee, or I don't know, I got like this thing that was like, this professor submitted you for this. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Doesn't he think I'm a complete idiot? And I went and talked to him about it. And he's like, I literally have no idea what you're talking about, Lee. Like, no idea.
I mean, honestly, to this day, I can't really remember what this was even about.
Oh, I remember what mine was about.
Yeah, I don't remember I blocked out the topic, but I do remember the feeling.
Yeah.
But what we now know after reading this article is that mistakes made with high confidence where you're then immediately corrected is actually one of the most powerful ways to absorb something and retain it. So all these horrible moments in class were actually really great learning opportunities.
I know. And so you might be saying, wait, my embarrassment and humiliation that I feel can lead to learning. And it looks like the research is pointing to yes. And one of the things I think we struggle with as Americans is that we are generally afraid of failure and we do what we can to just avoid it at all costs, even we'd rather be mediocre, I think, than fail. And but it turns out that as we learn, we need to create opportunities for failure so we can challenge ourselves and engage the part of the brain that learns from mistakes. Because apparently, which like when you really sit back and think about it, you're like, oh, well, of course, learning from mistakes would create like better learning, because from an evolutionary perspective, if I like eat something and it like makes me sick, I probably won't eat it again.
Right. Well, one of the things I thought was interesting in this article is they actually talk about the way that teachers are taught to teach. Mm-hmm. And so one of these ideas was that, you just show people the correct way to do something, and then that's how they learn it. And
then they call it just focusing on the process.
Yeah, so then like mistakes are considered bad because you're not following the right process. Mm-hmm. But what this article is pointing out is like that's actually not really that effective of a way to teach. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was a TA in a different class in architecture school, and we were actually doing math on the board. And I'm comfortable with math. I went to high school for science and math people. I'm feeling pretty confident. So, I'm working out this, relatively complicated math problem on the board about energy coming into the building and going out of the building or whatever it was. And, we had to figure out our insulation. And I remember looking up, and the professor came in at that exact moment when he was, kind of supervising. And he came in, I look up, and at the exact moment I realize I've just made a mistake on the board. And
in front of everybody.
In front of everyone. And it was several lines ago. Mm-hmm. And there was that moment of like, okay. I'm like, what do I do? And so, I kind of took a step back and I'm like, all right, class, we're going to engage in an exercise. Like
teachable moment.
Like, does anyone notice that maybe this answer is not correct? And finally, they were kind of looking at it. And one person said, yeah, actually, that's not right. And I'm like, well, how do you know? Like, where's the mistake? And they pointed out the mistake. I talked to the professor afterwards. He's like, yeah, I was a little concerned for a few minutes there, but you definitely handled it well. And in the end, actually, my people did better than anyone else. So I think it was a good learning strategy, but to actually make them, how do I know this is a mistake? Mm-hmm. Because it seemed correct. And then where in the process did I go wrong? Like that's actually highly educational.
True. And I think this is hard for law students because many of us are perfectionists, many of us are type A, and we don't want to either subject ourselves to any sort of failure, or we take it very personally and don't look at it as part of the, educational process. And I, while raising children, have really found it interesting to watch how they learn, because children make mistakes all the time.
Well, of course, because they don't know how to do anything.
Right. They don't know how to do anything.
Like they can't even feed themselves.
Right. Exactly. Or I always find it interesting. My son is very verbal, and I will correct his speech, like in a nice way. But if he's misusing a word, I'll oftentimes just mention, I'll just say, actually, it's this. And then he'll start to use the word. And then I watch him try and use it over and over again. And there's no like, I was using the incorrect word. He's just like, oh, that's the right word. Like he just rolls with it. And he typically retains that, that I corrected him, because he's also trying to practice it and implement it. And I oftentimes look at my kids and I wonder if we all had such levity around mistake making, what an adult existence would be like, because, kids are always falling down. Kids are always, making mistakes. And I think this fear around failure is something that they really learn from adults who are afraid of failing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's even interesting. I mean, part of the reason that I do things like take ski lessons is because I think it's important to put yourself in a position where you are not good at something and you're going to fail just as a practice. But even then, it's kind of funny because, of course, I fall down. Like, I don't love falling down, but it also doesn't really bother me that much as long as I'm not, like, injured. Mm-hmm. But some instructors really freak out about it. They come, like, running over, like, oh, my God, are you okay? I'm like, I was going really slowly and doing some weird exercise you gave me, and my skis crossed and I fell down. Like, I'm fine. Like, are you okay? Like, it's fine. I'm like learning to ski in a different way. I fell over, but it's not a big deal. I kind of expect that to happen.
And it's interesting when you, anytime you take some sort of parenting class or you read a book about toddlers who, when they fall down, and if there are many fall downs that don't create harm. So if it's a non-harm inducing fall down, the first thing they do is to look to the adult to wait for the reaction. Because if they do not know how to react themselves, they learn reactions from other people. So you can watch it. Once you know, you can see like kid goes boom, they spin around, look at mom or caretaker.
Are they freaking out?
Wait for the response. And they tell you your response is supposed to be like, oh, you went boom, great job getting up, or I had a friend who's every time her kid would get hurt, her response was always like, oh, you got hurt. Well, the body is amazing. You're not, the body will heal itself, instead of, like, oh my gosh, you're bleeding, you have a scrape, whatever. And I think that it really kind of opens up this idea to children are trying to learn, what these, we call them bonks in our house, but what these like little stumbles mean. And they're looking at the adults. And if we make a big deal out of them, then every single time they fall, they will freak out.
It's a big deal. And you're like, actually, you're fine.
Actually, you're fine. Like, it's like you hit your head, you start, really crying. I totally get that. That hurt. But you fall on your booty, moving on. Like, that happens all the time. And so, I think if you can just appreciate that some of our experiences around making mistakes is a learned reaction, then you can kind of undo it and open yourself up for some of the learning that can come when you're willing to really create situations for failure.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I always tried to remind myself about, and sometimes even my friends about, was, I'd rather make a mistake in class than on the exam.
Yeah.
If I actually did have some lack of clarity around this concept, I would rather find that out now instead of finding it out when I do poorly on the exam.
Right.
And, that doesn't, it's sort of you can psych yourself up type of thing, but it really does sort of work if you can say, okay, like, yes, I was wrong about that. Life goes on. Like, now I know.
Right. Yeah. And, I think with this example, we want to make sure that you understand that it doesn't mean that the only way that you can learn or open yourself up for making these mistakes is by volunteering in class, although you should do that and it would make your professors very happy. But there are other ways you can implement this idea, because what the research shows is you really don't learn anything by doing wild guessing. And I thought this was an interesting point that they made. True. It was like, if I was just like, what's the capital of X? And you were like, I don't know.
I'm like, I don't know. Is this some city I've heard of that might be in that same state. I'm not really thinking about this.
Right, exactly. You're not, then if I tell you the correct answer, you are not going to retain that.
I'll be like, oh, okay, great. It's Wyoming or Cheyenne or whatever.
Yeah, not Jackson Hole. I don't know. So you have to come up with your best right answer. So, because what you're doing is you're trying to like pull that information from your brain and then validate for your brain whether or not that was the right information. And it is called memory reconsolidation, because you are summoning up prior knowledge when you're trying to answer a question. And that's different from just like, picking something wildly off the top of your head. And so the research that they're doing with math students at a school in New York City is they've been giving them more quizzes. And, I think it's an interesting switch, right? Because it used to be like too much testing, too much, like evaluating. People will convince they don't know how to do things. But what they're actually finding is that by giving them more quizzes, as long as they are followed up by a review of students' specific errors, kind of like you were talking about what happened in your class, then the initial results show that it's actually helping performance, because they're reviewing what went wrong, and was the reviewing what went wrong or what went right is actually helping with the learning.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that makes sense, because, if you're actually really trying to get to the right answer and you think you got the right answer, and then suddenly it's pointed out to you that you didn't, and you have to figure out where you went wrong, it does make sense that that's going to stick in your brain, because your brain is really trying to identify that.
Right. And it's an engagement. We talk a lot on this podcast and in our blogs and with our students about active learning. And wrestling with material is active learning.
Yeah, I talked to someone the other day in law school. It's kind of funny, who said, oh, yeah. I mean, of course, I asked, like, did you do practice questions before you got your disappointing grades? And they said, oh, yeah, I did a lot. I'm like, well, did you have sample answers? No, but I was pretty sure I was getting them right. It's like, well,
from what you're just yourself.
I'm guessing that what we need to do is have you do things that we have answers to and review those answers, because clearly something in this process is not going correctly. But I just thought it was funny. Oh, I did them. And then did you look at the answer? Oh, no, I didn't have the answers.
Yeah.
But I was sure I was getting it right. I'm like, yeah, your grades don't reflect that.
Yeah. So, when you think about how to implement some of these lessons into your studying, I think the first thing you have to do is just be honest about this idea that law students don't like to be wrong or fail. And if you struggle with this, you should read Carol Dweck's book. And you should try and work on your growth mindset, because that's the other thing that this article talked about, was that students who had a growth mindset were able to take in this kind of negative feedback about their performance and do something with it. So for the cheap seats, if people have not heard us go on and on and on about Carol and her work, Alison, you want to give a summary of the growth mindset?
Well, the growth mindset is basically when you encounter some type of obstacle, basically you look at what happened and what resources can you draw upon to get better at this in the future. Whereas the fixed mindset would make you say, basically, I got this question wrong. I should probably drop out of law school because I'm going to be a terrible lawyer. I'm not smart enough to do this. There's no way I can ever learn this. I'm going to give up.
Right.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell. And, you know, I think that this goes back to your point of like learning how to ski. Like I'm starting to work on learning a new foreign language. I would not consider myself to be a great language speaker. I've never been great.
I'm very bad at languages, and I still learn Spanish eventually.
Right. But, you know, it's interesting because I don't like to do things that I'm bad at. Just find, you know, my personality structure. And I am constantly having to coach myself through this idea of this makes me uncomfortable, but I'm going to do it anyway. You know, this doesn't mean that, I'm not smart. That doesn't mean I can't do it. This just means that I'm going to have to work a little harder and I'm going to have to like keep marching on. And I think that it's very easy to get complacent and not do hard things. And I think even in law school, let's say, you know, you really understand torts, but then you get to real property and future interests make your head spin. You know, coming at that with a growth mindset is the way that you can actually learn that stuff, or you just fold and then you get a C in real property.
And then you struggle on the bar.
Right.
So don't do that.
Exactly.
Go ahead and make yourself a chart right now. Sit down for a few hours. You can use that chart for years. Trust me.
Yep.
Still have our charts. Still have the one I made, the one page, like future interest. Because the point is like, that's not like that's easy material for anyone.
It's hard for everybody.
And it's just a question of like, you know, are you going to spend the time and energy that's required to really try to dig into this and understand it and put it together in a way that makes sense to you, which is absolutely doable. Mm-hmm. Or are you just kind of dial it in and like, you know, do a few things and then move on with your life and be like, I guess I just suck at property.
Right.
What can you do?
Yeah. So what we want you to start thinking about now that we've convinced you to work on a growth mindset, which is its own project.
Right.
So listen to our podcast.
It's an ongoing process.
It's an ongoing process. We want you to think about how you can engage in testing yourself and encouraging yourself to make mistakes. And so you could do this a lot of different ways. You could give yourself quizzes. I think that this could be very effective.
Yeah.
You know, you could write an outline and create a quiz for yourself. I bet you would never forget the material if you created your own quiz.
That's true.
Yeah. You could do hypos. You can test yourself, test your memory. You can drill, but you need to do something to recall this information. And like the study said, really give yourself a chance to pull this information out of your brain. Because I think what happens a lot in law school is we get so comfortable with our little outlines. We get so cozy with them. We're like, oh, well, I don't need to know this material because I can reference it. But your brain isn't really like holding on to any information if it's on the paper. You have to really try and stick it in your brain.
Yeah, it's kind of like you got it on the paper, so now you can forget about it.
Right.
I find that with my to-do list.
Oh, yes.
Once it's on my Trello board, I literally look at that a day later and be like, wow, I had no recollection of any of these things because that's the whole point. I got them out of my head.
Or like calendaring. Now that we have like our electronic calendars, I think last night was like before we went to bed, my husband's like, what's your day look like tomorrow? I was like, I don't know.
My calendar will tell me. When I wake up, it'll tell me what to do.
It'll tell me what time I'm supposed to be places, you know? I had to like go find my phone and be like, this is where I'm supposed to be at 9. I guess I need to do things so I can be somewhere at 9. Like, I don't know, like it's really funny, but I used to hold a lot of that information in my brain, but now since it lives on my phone, I don't.
Yeah. So this is another reason I like the examples and explanation series a lot too, for first year students particularly.
Yep.
Is that really forces you to use the material. And again, like what we're really ideally looking for is this high confidence that you're correct when you're not. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if you answer these questions, you're like, yep, I've totally got this. And then you're like, ooh, actually, no, I don't.
Right.
That is a very valuable moment.
It is. And I think this goes back to that. And we see this in our bar work because when you do like stacks of multiple choice questions, and if you're doing multiple choice practice in law school, it's the same thing. People will do, 15 and be like, oh, I got 7 wrong.
Moving on. Or like maybe they'll look at the ones they got wrong. But what we actually ask our students to do is when they take the question, we ask them, how confident are you about this answer? Because if you're 100% confident and you're wrong, I want you to figure out why.
Yeah.
What went wrong there?
Yeah.
Why is this not correct?
Yeah. And I think that even the knowledge of the law, the thing that can tell you about your understanding of the law by having high confidence and being wrong, or having low confidence. If you have low confidence because you don't know the law at all, that's a different type of studying.
Right.
Than being highly confident and then knowing the law, but applying it to the facts incorrectly. And so that is why all of your studying, whether or not you're applying it to examples and explanations, or a hypo from your professor, or a practice multiple choice, or a Cali exercise, whatever it might be, is you need to think about, what, like the fact that you got it wrong, but also why you got it wrong, and do that deep dive. Was it the facts? Did you get it wrong because you knew the law, but like you're not good yet at distinguishing legally significant facts?
Well, or sometimes people just literally like mix people up in the fact pattern, stuff like that happens a lot. And you might think, oh, well, I just mix them up. It's like, but no, if that's something that keeps happening to you, you've got to figure out a way not to do that.
Then you got to write down the names, or you have to do
a diagram.
Right.
Like, you know that you need to be more careful not to mix people up than the average person.
Yep. You also need to figure out if, like I mentioned earlier, is this a knowledge of the law problem? Is it like I didn't memorize my 4-prong test, or do I not understand what those 4 prongs mean? These are all things that you really need to learn from. And I think that so often people will say, I did all the practice exams. But then my question is, but did you get all the feedback?
Right.
Either from yourself, from your study group, from your professor, from your TA, from a tutor. Who told you whether or not you did it right? And then what did you do with that? Because then I'll be like, did you rewrite it?
Yeah, the rewrite. Love the rewrite.
Love the rewrite. And then they'll be like, no, I didn't have time. That's my favorite. I didn't have time to rewrite it. It's like, but you did have time to do more busy work.
Right.
So if you have time to do busy work, you can have time to rewrite it.
Yeah, I love people that are like, I didn't have time to make a flow chart. I'm like, That's because it actually requires you to sit down and really understand this, doesn't it? It seemed easier just to take somebody else's outline and read over it.
Yeah. And so when you think about kind of the advice that comes from this article, and I do hope that you'll click on the show notes and read the whole thing, because I think it is very interesting. I think it really lends itself to the rewrite process when it comes to writing, because it's saying it's not just about the process. It's about going back, figuring out what went wrong, and then figuring out how to do it the right way. You're teaching your brain the right outcome after a mistake. And I think that's very important.
Right. What's it like? Anything that wires together or something, the more you do something wrong, the more your brain is laying that neural pathway. But then the more you correct that, you're actually laying down a different neural pathway that's going in the correct direction. And that's what we want you to do.
Yeah. I mean, this stuff is not easy, but we just waste so much time studying ineffectively. It's amazing.
Yeah, because it feels more comfortable.
Yeah.
It feels scary to possibly make mistakes and do these things. I mean, it's not pleasant. I remember when I took the first torts test, the day before the exam, which was way too late, and missed that wild animals were strict liability if you kept them as pets. Right. I will never in my life forget that. I will be on my deathbed thinking, oh, God, that lion. You're definitely going to be like, whatever that lion eats, you're going to be liable for it.
Yep.
I will literally never forget that. And before I took that test, the sample one, I didn't even know that.
Yep.
I mean, I knew it on some level, maybe, but I totally missed it. I will never miss that again.
Yeah. So the other thing I think you can think about, not just, struggling with this material for yourself, but you can think about the examples in the classroom. And if you have a study group or even a group of friends that you sometimes study with, I think you could really, do this stuff together. I will say, I remember when we were studying future interests, which I was very flummoxed by in the beginning, that we got in a study room and we started we would take turns trying to do the problems on the board. And that is really how I learned that material, is kind of walking through it, finding mistakes, doing it again. And so you can create these kind of teaching environments even in your study group. And I think that can be very powerful.
Yeah, because, ultimately, who really cares if you're walking through some, complicated future interest problem and you get to the end, you're like, oh, wait, actually, that's not the right of reverter. It's really the right of entry. And it was like, oh, right, that's the right of entry. Whatever. I'm making these up.
You are. But,
the
right of reentry.
The reentry. I'm like reverting reentry. Anyway, point being, we would know this at some point if we needed to. But, I think ultimately, it doesn't really matter that much. If you get it wrong to start with, that's the whole point of the process, is you're working together to get these right. And soon just approaching it almost, much more of a way of a kid falling down, oh, no, it's not that, it's this. Oh, good to know. All right. We're circling in on what's correct.
Right. And just letting those mistakes go and realize that the struggle is real, but the struggle is the magic part.
Well, and also, like, every time you get a mistake, you're seeing kind of what's outside of that box of what, because, these are really just definitions, basically.
Right.
You're looking at, like, it's kind of like your son with a word, like, oh, that word doesn't mean what I thought it meant. Okay, I wonder what it does mean. Let me, like, test that a little bit. Does it mean this? Does it mean that? Oh, how's that different than this? You're looking to see exactly what's in that box.
Yep. And one of the problems we see with law students is just that they're hesitant to test themselves because they don't want to be wrong.
Oh, yeah, I love that one. Like, oh, I can't do the question because I don't know the law well enough.
Right. And the problem is that the research is going to show when you dive in is that from a neuroscience perspective, you've got to study and test that knowledge to be able to know it well enough. It's all part of the process.
Right. Like you can't know the law in some abstract way. You have to know. I mean, you might be able to give us legal trivia.
Right.
The elements of X are A, B, C, and D. It's like, okay, great. You know that sort of. That's step one in knowing.
Right.
Yeah.
And almost everyone in the room, I think this is one of the most powerful things somebody told me when I was a 1L. Everyone in the room will know the legal trivia, especially if it's an open book test. They're really going to know the legal trivia.
Yeah, it's going to be right in front of you.
Right. So then how are you going to differentiate yourself? And it's through the heavy lifting of understanding how that law is applied to facts, being excellent at reading the fact patterns and doing that analysis. And this type of quizzing and pushing yourself to make mistakes is going to be one way that you can differentiate yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Because to know it because it's on paper in front of you is different than being able to use it.
Yep.
And yeah, you want to, if you've really worked with that material, you've kind of pushed the contours of it. You might even have some interesting thoughts about it.
Ooh, you can go to office hours.
Yeah, you can go talk to your professor about it. And maybe then that, that's really what differentiates those very top exams is that you can tell the person has really worked with this material. They've really thought about it.
Yep.
And, a solid test is basically going to, get that out on the paper in one way or another.
Yeah. If you can get out of your own way and allow yourself to wrestle with this stuff, it's fascinating. The law is fascinating. I mean, not every single class. Like, I hate civil procedure. But generally speaking, I know you love it. It's okay. We have a difference in opinion.
And actually on the exam, like what he ended up testing us on was this sort of like really deep gray area that I'd identified at one point in my own struggle with the material. And I sort of was like getting into the question. I'm like, oh, wait, I think that's that place where I wasn't sure what that answer was. Huh. Okay. And then it turned out that actually my friend who was also a TA on his exam, he had come out to a different answer. And that, like, we were both TAs in the class, like we had done that work to realize that this was a really hard question.
But that's like what makes the law fun.
It was entertaining. It was great.
Yeah, the law is fun if you get into it and really understand it. I think the law becomes really dry and painful when you're just reading outlines and trying to do legal trivia.
Well, and just trying to memorize stuff. You're not really trying to learn. You're trying to be like, oh, I have to remember like everything that's in here.
Right.
A, that doesn't work. And B, that's not really the point.
No. All right. Well, we are wrapping up on time. Any final thoughts about learning?
Well, I think, like you said, this is not easy. And I think it's not something we're really trained to be that comfortable with. But you can also retrain yourself. And I personally think doing things that are hard, that you're interested in, particularly for me, it tends to be physical stuff in one way or another, whether that's skiing or snowboarding or, taking dance classes or even doing pottery or something, just to let yourself have that experience of like, oh, I enjoy this even though I'm not perfect at it. And I'm learning something and that's fun,
Yep. I think that's true. I think that this kind of growth mindset muscle almost is something that can be exercised in a lot of different ways. And, I think especially as we age and as we become, if we become parents or, anything, it's easier to stop learning new things.
Yeah, but that's basically the way that your brain and body start decaying.
Right.
So don't do that.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.